How did birds evolve flight? It's actually an incredibly tricky question. It's been debated for over 150 years. So we'll look at this paper in Nature magazine about 50 years after a landmark study turned the entire debate on its head. So the debate really began in the 1870s or so, when paleontologists and ornithologists first broached the issue of how did birds evolve flight, because you have a whole bunch of things that they had to get right with their thin bones and the way that the wings worked. And they started using imaginary ancestries, imaginary life histories, and imaginary aerodynamics to try to figure all of this out. And it was all theorizing. The one thing that they mostly agreed on is that birds evolved from reptiles, but beyond that, no one was really sure. So, it was in 1974 that John Ostrom turned everything on its head with this landmark paper. Because what was happening before was there were two major theories. There was the arboreal trees down theory, as in you had these gliding animals and they eventually learned how to fly because of that. Or you had the contrasting ground up theory, that animals started on the ground and that's where they started to learn their wings. And so, as this paper kind of cheekily puts it, in the trees down scenario, birds evolved from a terrestrial quadruped reptile that somehow became bipedal, walked on its legs, then somehow started climbing trees, then somehow began jumping between branches, and eventually somehow gliding, and then somehow evolved into powered flight. The contrasting ground up scenario had the bird ancestors were terrestrial reptiles that somehow became bipedal, and that as good runners they were free to elaborate their forelimbs somehow into wings. And as they say, there was no real empirical evidence for either of these scenarios. But Ostrom had been studying Archaeopteryx, the great missing link between birds and dinosaurs. And with studying that, as well as looking at the evolutionary history of gliding animals, gliding has evolved about 24 times in vertebrates, yet none of them ever became something that converted to powered flight. It didn't seem like those two things lined up. And also, when you looked at modern birds and these gliders, there was no morphological similarities. They didn't seem like the same thing. But the dinosaurs did. Certain groups of dinosaurs with the bone structure, they looked like they would evolve into things that could fly, like Archaeopteryx. So he effectively killed the tree down theory, but there still wasn't evidence for the ground up theory. Why would they evolve these wings? And one of his guesses was that they used them for hunting as insect nets. Once they could have some free forelimbs, they could use them to hunt and get more food. However, that idea was very unpopular. And also, it didn't really explain getting to the point of true wings, which involve an aerofoil, which is a wing that is rigid enough to direct air, but flexible enough to deform usefully, a flight stroke that uses the wing to generate a vortex so it can fly, all the metabolic adaptations and neuromuscular coordination to permit this 3D locomotion. I mean, there's a lot to evolve into powered flight. So Ostrom had reframed the debate, but we still didn't know exactly why they were doing this. And then it turns out you can look at modern birds and see why. For baby birds who cannot fly yet, when they are running away from a predator, they can run up a tree because of their wings giving them balance. And so if you can run away from a predator 3% better than your cousin who cannot, you're going to get better and better at wings until the point where you're almost jumping forward with your wings. And once you're jumping with your wings, you're starting to it's close enough that you might actually start flying with your wings. So the reason that birds evolved flight was from running away from predators up steep banks and their wings giving them the balance to do so, and then wings just became more and more useful. And that's how we got the dinosaur to bird pipeline.